Hi, I'm Nick Bolton, the founder of the International Centre for Coaching Supervision, and thank you for watching this presentation. This talk is about how, as supervisors, we can work with what's really in front of us, which is the thing that's happening now, the supervisee that's in front of us, the experience we're having, and the space that we as a supervisor and the supervisee are creating between us. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years has been the tendency and the habit of supervisors and indeed supervisees to focus on what's out there somewhere. And that's perfectly normal, and it's very useful to focus on what's out there, but not to the exclusion of what's in here. And I think what I'd like to get across in the course of the next, whatever long this takes, um, is this idea that we need to spend more time thinking about what is happening here that might be reflective of what's happening out there. Now, this is something we talk about a lot in supervision, and it's something that supervisors in general speak about, but I often find it doesn't happen in practice. So what I want to talk about to you today is not only the theory, if you like, what potentially can we look at and how can we look at it, but also what stops us doing that in the first place. And I remember when I first trained as a supervisor, I had a very experienced supervisor work with me as my supervisor of my coaching and of my supervision. And throughout this journey, the supervisor kept, suggesting, Nick, you must share what you're feeling with your supervisees. You must engage with the experience that you're having right now to explore what is happening in the room that might be indicative of stuff that's happening out there. And by the time we got to the 10th session, it suddenly struck me, but we haven't done that. And I said to my supervisor, I noticed that after 10 sessions, we haven't spoken about what's happening between us, and we haven't spoken about how we relate and what that might be saying about my supervision or how I show up as a coach. And with a degree of kind of horror, she said, "Oh my goodness, Nick, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. I feel like I owe you 10 more sessions." Now, of course, it wasn't the issue that she did anything wrong or that she owed me 10 more sessions, but I think it brought home to both of us in that moment how easy it is to slip into, let's explore what's happening over there with that client, with that group, with that thought process, with that workload, whatever it might be. And let's not focus on what's happening here and how that might be indicative of something that needs to be explored. So in this presentation, I'm going to be looking exactly at that. So without further ado, let's dive in. I'm just going to share my screen. And here we go. So now is where the work is. Now, in reality, that's a rather dramatic statement because, yes, now is where the work is, and that you're doing the work now with your supervisee. But of course, what I'm really trying to say there is that now, at this moment, is where the work is in terms of what you can look at. But in reality, it's just as equally important, of course, to look at what's out there. But nonetheless, I really want to make the point that too often we don't look at what's happening right at this moment and we look at what's over there. So now is where the work is, harnessing the present moment and supervision. I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder of International Centre for Coaching Supervision. And, my passion, if you like, is exploring what are the ideas and practices that lie behind coaching, transformative coaching in particular, and also coaching supervision, and how can we as practitioners enhance the work we do. So let's talk about, first of all, the power of the present. When we sit down with a supervisee, we have a space that's created between us. We have a moment that will never be repeated again. That moment, of course, is the present. And that present holds stuff. It holds information, it holds dynamics, it holds emergence of ways of being that in themselves can be valuable to the supervision process. And so when we think about the power of the present, we often look backwards. What happened back there? Tell me about the session. Tell me about the client. Tell me about what you did. Tell me about how you felt. Or we look outwards to what we want to happen. So what do you think you will do? What would you like to change? How would you like to be instead? What will you do differently? And so on. And all those things are perfectly valid, but they don't relate to the present as such. So what I want to challenge you to think about as a supervisor is, what if some of the richest insights are right here and right now? And we'll take a look at what that means in practice as we go through this presentation. But it's certainly something I've seen a lot. We do, of course, we teach new coaching supervisors, and one of the things I notice a lot is that the journey they go on is shifting, in many cases, shifting from a focus on the there and then to a balance of the here and now and the there and then. In other words, instead of exclusively looking at what happened back then and over there, we start to use both. And so in this session, we'll explore how the present moment can unlock hidden dynamics, not only between you and your supervisee, but between your supervisee and the coach, or the coach and the system, or the client and the system, in such a way that will deepen the impact of the supervision that you are engaging in. So what I hope that we'll get to from the next however long it takes is to, first of all, to help you recognize and work with emergent dynamics in real time. In other words, it's one thing to have a esprit d'escalier and think, if only I'd said this back then in the session, I should have thought about this. It's too late. That's not the present moment. That's a kind of looking backwards at what you could have done as a supervisor. What I'd love you to start to be able to do is to recognize it as it is happening and to work with it in the supervision session, to notice what's emerging as dynamics between you or energies that can be used towards the supervision. And as such, one of the things I want to explore is how you can tune into your own embodied experience for a form of data. In other words, what are you experiencing in different ways, whether that's somatically or cognitively, within yourself, that can say something needs to be explored here beyond simply looking at the narrative of what happened somewhere else. And then to use the present moment to access systemic insight. In other words, how is the wider system of the organization or the familial setting or the whatever it is that's the coaching is taking place in, how is that finding its way into the supervision, and how by noticing that can you begin to then bring your awareness back out to that system? How can the impact of the organization in the supervision be then fed back into the way the coach shows up in the organization and with the client? And then finally, I want to leave you with some experiments that you can do to work in a very live and relational way and in a systemic way to practice the art of working in the present moment. Okay, so let's dive in and we'll take a look at the temptation to analyze, which is something that I think a lot of supervisors and indeed coaches can fall into. One of the things we often see is that supervision becomes a space of content. What happened? Tell me about. What did you do next? What would you like to do? What models did you use? How did it feel? Etc., etc. In other words, you put the magnifying glass on the content of the session. And as a result, you go into an analytical mode. So what could have been done differently? So what did you think happened as a result of that? And all these sort of questions are looking at what's already been and gone, which again, I'm going to keep reiterating this, is an important part of supervision. The problem is that it can often be to the detriment of what's happening right now in front of you. So it can be very tempting to go into this analytical space of let's explore the content. And one of the things I'd encourage you as a supervisor is if you find yourself talking about the content, talking about the content, talking about the content, take a step back, pause and think, hold on, let's now just momentarily pause to think what's happening between us. And I think one of the reasons why this can be the case is that the there and then feels a lot safer than the here and now. And it also feels more structured. We know how to go through the seven-eyed model, if you like, in terms of, well, tell me about the client. What did they come for? What do they want? How do they react? Tell me about how you coached. What are the interventions you used? What kind of models are you using? Hey, tell me about how it felt between you. Tell me how you felt. Tell me what was going through your mind. All these things, they're quite structured and simple, and we feel safe following that process. And so that puts us in a there and then mindset, which keeps us locked into the history of what's gone on. And finally, it also aligns with traditional coaching. If you think about coaching, it's a natural progression in supervision to carry on that coaching process, which is to say, what is it that you want? What's happening already? What do you find happens when you try to change things? How might you change things? What do you believe that's impacting this? And again, it goes into an analytical process around the coaching that the client needs. And so it's very natural for a supervisor to fall into the same, I was going to say trap. It's not really a trap, but it's a pattern. Let's say they fall into the same pattern of using analysis as the natural go-to. But there are some pitfalls of relying on analysis, some pitfalls of thinking in terms of analysis only. The first thing is when we're analyzing what happened over there, we miss what's emerging right now. Often we stay with the story that's unfolding in in the past, and we miss what's unfolding right now because we're focused on the, if you like, the cause and effect, the cause of what happened and then what happened and then what happened and why, rather than how are we experiencing that together? What am I noticing myself? What are you noticing yourself? What's happening between us that might point to something else we should look at beyond the initial story that you began to tell? It can also lead to a temptation to over-intellectualize. I mean, I've been guilty of this myself. Anyone who knows me knows that I tend to think theoretically. It's a kind of thing I like to do, but of course we can't do it to the exclusion of other things. But there is a risk of over-intellectualizing, where the reflection on what happened, particularly from a theoretical perspective, can become very cerebral and disconnected from emotion or embodied insight. In other words, if let's say we take a I don't know, let's say we take a transactional analysis lens on something that happened back then, and all of a sudden we find ourselves analyzing the parent adult child states and what transactions were taking place and were they complementary or ulterior or crossed, or what strokes was somebody receiving, and all that might be incredibly useful, but it might also be disembodied from the reality of what the client and the coach experience together. And it can be a risk that we simply layer on this pattern of intellectualization rather than getting to the root of how does it feel for you to be experiencing the client that way, or how does it feel for me to be experiencing you as a supervisee this way? It can also lead us to what I call their system blindness, because without the present moment of attention, we can often miss systemic influences. They become things we talk about in the abstract rather than feeling in the moment. When a system intrudes into supervision, we can feel it in a very visceral sense. Where's that coming from? It doesn't belong here, and yet it's here. If we don't notice that strange juxtaposition of systems and what we think should be happening, we can miss a lot of information. So we end up with what I call system blindness. And it's really critical that the more we tune into what's showing up in this space, the more we can be alive to the way the system is showing up. And then finally, diminished impact. If we only rely on what happened there and then, we can often miss some of the most profound emotional shifts that we can create for a coach, what we might think of as transformational. So you can think of it as being like as I say there, an informational shift rather than a transformational shift. And I think it's really critical that as supervisors, we're helping other coaches we work with to create transformations in their understanding of the practice, not simply informed transactions, let's say. So with all that said, we've taken a look at now why analysis can be tempting. I want to look now at the seven-eyed model and how we can begin to shift our attention to where the here and now work really happens. You see, if you think about the seven-eyed model, when you look at I1, it's the client. When you look at I6, it's the supervisor, and I7, of course, being the system that wraps around it. And when you actually start to think about I1 to I6, you could say it's an ever increasing distance from the client. And that might initially sound like, well, why would that be a good thing? Well, what it enables us to do by moving them further and further away from the client, is, so long as we don't forget the client, is it enables us to first of all, take a wider view on what's the whole system that's having an impact on the coaching relationship, but it also allows us to get into all the moving parts of the coaching, not only the client's desires and reactions. And if you think about the seven-eyed model as being there and then, it tends to be that I1, I2, I3, I4. I1, the client, I2, the interventions, I3, the relationship between the coach and the client, and I4, the coach's interior response, if you like, or their internal response. All that's happening typically over there. When we look into I5, I6, and I7, we start to, particularly I5 and I6, we start to look at the more here and now experience, with I7 being something that happens both there and then and here and now. And we'll explore that in a second. So let's take a look at I's 1 to 3 as the client work, I4, the supervisor's internal experience, and I5, the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, I6, the supervisor's internal experience, and I7, the wider system, cultural, organizational, societal, familial, etc., professional. And of course, if you've been keeping up to date with the presentations I've been doing, I recently did one called Mirrors and Echoes, which was a deep dive look at I5, essentially looking at parallel process. And so we're not going to go into such depth again on I5, but we will talk in the round about how I4, I5, I6, and I7 enable us to work with the here and now experience as opposed to the then and there experience. So if we think about I4, the supervisee's internal landscape, and then we think about relational cues coming from the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee in I5, and then your own embodied response as a supervisor and systemic echoes as I7, these all become, if you like, pathways into the present moment. And they all allow the present moment to be pathways back into those areas. Let's take a look at each one of them. So first of all, the supervisee's internal landscape, I4. When we think of I4, we often, especially from a there and then perspective, we often think about what was happening for you? How did it feel? What response did you have? Past tense, past tense, past tense. But actually, I4 is most powerful in many ways when you're talking about what's happening right now. So as you talk about this, present tense, what emotions are surfacing right now? Not what did you feel, but what do you feel? And that's a very different thing. Not only is it different in terms of temporally, i.e., one's past tense and one's present tense, but it's different qualitatively. The the emotion that somebody felt back then is not only diluted, but it's also now being recreated from an imaginative perspective. Somebody's having to recreate it to talk it through. And there's going to be a lot of filters on that experience that have happened from when it actually happened to them describing the narrative of what it felt like to you. But when you ask what's happening right now, all of a sudden they talk about this is how I feel now. And that is a lived truth in that moment. As I think about it now, what I really feel is sadness or shame or anxiety or embarrassment or doubt or fear or whatever it might be. They might have said what I felt back then was annoyance, but what I feel now is shame about how I reacted to it. So thinking about I4 from a there and then and here and now perspective brings up much more information. So we can then look also at, when we think about the supervisor's internal landscape, what shifts in their current language, in the pace, how fast they're describing this, their affect, their emotion. How visible are these things? What's visible to you as a supervisor, and what do they notice? I notice that as I'm talking to you, I'm finding myself feeling a little bit sad and disappointed in myself, or I'm finding myself feeling quite proud of myself, whatever the thing might be. And you might notice that their pace picks up and the language becomes more simple because they're attaching to more clear thoughts rather than obtuse intellectual language. So you're looking at all these shifts that can reflect a movement in the I4. And then how might these reflect a living dynamic that's coming from their coaching work? In other words, what is their current experience? What's the current dynamic saying about their coaching work? Are they bored of it, excited by it? Are they in a state of ennui? Have they reached a plateau? Do they feel stuck? What does that stuckness feel like to them? So rather than them describing it, they're feeling it. So when we think about the I4, it's really critical. Let me just wrap this piece up. When we think about the I4, it's really critical that we don't simply talk about the there and then I4, but the here and now I4, and get them to talk about how they are experiencing it right now. And it's something I notice that a lot of supervisors don't do. It seems strange when you think about it, because as coaches, it's what we do. But somehow as a supervisor, we distance ourselves from the here and now, and we put the lens on what happened over there with that client. As a supervisor, I encourage you to really help the coach feel into their emotions that are coming up right now, feel into the way they're communicating, feel into their physiology and the way they're representing themselves right now. How do you notice yourself speaking at the moment as you consider this coaching session? All these sorts of things are going to bring up the here and now versus the there and then. Okay, so we talked, as I mentioned, we did this lecture recently on echoes and mirrors, and so I'm not going to go into too much depth about this other than to explore at a high level this idea that what's happening between you, the supervisor, and them, the supervisee, can often speak volumes about what's happening somewhere else in the system. And the first thing to notice is what is happening between us in this moment. Now, of course, you don't need to be doing this constantly. There's no point just stopping for the sake of it, but if you notice something, if you notice a pattern, and one of the things I often say is like, what doesn't belong here? If what's happening between us in this moment belongs here and it's natural, it's probably not going to tell you too much about what's happening somewhere else in the system. It's just the way the supervision is working. It's meant to work that way. But if something doesn't belong there, like where's this tension coming from that doesn't seem to belong to me or to the coach? Why do we feel between us tense? Where's this anxiety coming from me to get a result for this person when I don't normally feel anxious? Where's this demand for me to do something for this person coming from in them that isn't my responsibility? All of these things are what's happening between us in this moment that we can say, hey, let's stop and observe this. So you might be looking for, is there tension? Is there alignment? Is there avoidance? Is there collusion? Collusion is such an interesting one because it feels so comfortable. It's the classic, TA game that's being played when you're colluding with your coach, supervisee. If you can just notice it in time, whoa, we're colluding. What's that a reflection of? Where is that coming from? Why do we both feel the need to feel comfortable about this? Or what's the system creating in us that wants us to be in alignment in such a way? And as we know from I5 and from the lecture I gave recently, that this dynamic that's happening between us in this moment, it often mirrors something that's happening either in the coach-client relationship, in the client-system relationship, or in the system as a whole. It doesn't have to be the coach-client relationship, but it's going to be happening somewhere in the system. There could be a tension, a demand, a requirement for progress, whatever it might be. But it can often mirror something. And by bringing it out into the light, we can start to say, well, how is that impacting your coaching? And how can you, as a coach, begin to challenge that or question it or work with it in a more meaningful, mindful way? So then we have this supervisee's embodied responses, I6. This, I've got to say, is probably the one that supervisors struggle with most. And I think it's because they were brought up as a coach, if you like, to bracket their stuff, what they consider their stuff. Oh, that's my stuff. It's not for me to say. But in supervision, we're trying to use what we're feeling. We're not trying to use anything. We're not just saying, well, anything's fair game, because it might literally be your stuff. If you're stressed because your hamster died this morning, that's not relevant to supervision. But if you're noticing something inside yourself that isn't about what's happened in your own personal life, but that somehow is responding to what's happening in you at the moment with the supervisee, that isn't your stuff. That's worth exploring. So the first thing to notice is what is happening in you as a supervisor. What do you notice somatically or physically or mentally, cognitively, all these sorts of things. So noticing bodily sensations, emotional responses, cognitive shifts, all these sorts of things. This can be tricky because it can feel like a judgment. If feeling you have is tiredness, like a sort of a that can feel like a judgment that this person is boring you. So I can see why somebody would be constrained in sharing that, but actually it's how you share it, and we'll come to that later. But just simply noticing the sensation is the first step. Noticing the emotional response, first step. Noticing the cognitive shift, first step. I noticed as you were talking, this is what happened to me up in my mind. I noticed as you're talking to me, this is what happened to my body. You're not judging, you're not interpreting, you're naming. And so you can think of this in terms of your internal data is simply part of the wider system. You're not a discrete, disconnected, disembodied item. You are part of the system that's being impacted by the supervisee, who's being impacted by the coach, who's been impacted by the supervisee, who's been impacted by the client, who's been impacted by the system. And you're part of a profession as well, which is also impacting all of this. If you find yourself coaching in a particular kind of way, as a coach, coaching in a particular kind of way, because you're part of the ICF or the AC or the EMCC or the ILM or whatever it might be. And if you're the supervisor, you might notice, how is that professional hat impacting this? And then finally, systemic echoes. And for me, this is probably not so much the most important, but it's the one that's in a sense omnipresent. We can think of it in terms of this: what's being unconsciously reenacted from the wider system. And we've talked about this already, even on this presentation, but let me just recap what I mean. The idea of things being unconsciously reenacted from the wider system is simply that you, as a supervisor and your supervisee, don't exist in a bubble. You don't exist in a walled off vacuum. Instead, what's happening is the system that both of you belong to in different ways is going to find its way into that supervision. And that system can then be looked at in terms of something to navigate, to explore, to manage in some way, to respond to, and so on. For instance, if the supervisee is coming in a state of stress, there's a good chance that that stress is somehow communicating its way through the system from maybe an organization to the client, to the coach, and then to the supervision process. Maybe you're both part of some governing body, and that's constricting how the coach feels they can work, because, well, I can't do that because this body says I can't do that. Noticing how that system is influencing the coach, maybe even you as a supervisor, is very, very worthwhile doing. It can be quite invisible until you start to consciously point it out and bring it to notice. So organizational norms, cultural expectations, legacy tensions, all of these things can be showing themselves up in this space. And so, we often talk about ghosts and stakeholders, and I wrote a blog post on this some time ago. This was a phrase that Robin Showett used, ghosts and stakeholders, and it really rang true for me. There are often these ghosts or stakeholders who are influencing the coaching or influencing the supervision. And you can ask a question: who or what isn't in the room but is influencing it? Who or what's present in some way? What voices, what characters, what drivers are in the room that we haven't noticed? And you can sort of think of them as just hovering around, and let's not let it hover, let's name it. Okay, so how do we actually do this? We've talked about the concepts. Now, how do we actually do it? Well, there are a number of ways we can think about it. Number one is what you might call phenomenological noticing. And I've already talked about this a bit, which is simply being aware of what's happening and then describing it. I find myself feeling like this. How do you find yourself feeling at the moment? Without trying to interpret it, the art of phenomenology is to name what is without trying to work out why it is in the first instance. Simply, if you have a feeling, you have a feeling. Now, that feeling might be nothing to do with what's going on in the supervision, but it might be. If you say, I've got this feeling of anxiety in the pit of my stomach, that means that there's a problem in your coaching. That would not be phenomenological, that would be interpretive. Whereas as you're talking, I find myself feeling a little anxious, and I wonder what that might mean. That's a very different approach. It means that you're not attaching anything to it in the first instance, but you're opening up the possibility that it might mean something. Secondly is using psychodynamic attunement. So I talk a lot about that in Mirrors and Echoes, but if you have psychodynamic awareness, you can start to think, what projection is going on here, what transference, what counter-transference, all these things that come from the psychodynamic world. I would encourage you to watch my video on Mirrors and Echoes. It goes into this in a lot more depth, but noticing the psychodynamic concepts at play can be very useful for beginning to engage in the present system. How might there be transference that's coming not from the person direct, but transferring through the whole system, from the system to the client to the coach to you? How's there a transference process? How is there projective identification taking place, and so on? And then Gestalt awareness techniques, beginning to really feel into the body and feel into what we call the field. What's in the field that we can begin to observe and bring it into a figural space that we can start to explore it. So from the background to the foreground, so that we can begin to talk about it. And then somatic tracking, whether that's pace of speaking, whether it's the breath, whether it's temperature, whatever it might be. How is your body changing? Yours as a supervisor, but also your clients. How might you notice the way they're reacting physically? And how can you begin to use that as part of the process? I notice when we talk about this, you're breathing a little faster, and I wonder what that might say about all of this, and so on. That's somatic tracking. And then sometimes the use of silence, just allowing yourself to stay still for a while with the client as you begin to process what's coming up, and allowing them to say, you know what, I'm beginning to notice that right in this moment, I'm feeling sad about this. Use that silence to allow the emotion to cement itself and to be available to be talked about. And then dialogic presence, simply ensuring that you're in a process of constant flow and emergence between you, rather than going through a process from A to B to C to D to E. The dialogic presence, one in which there's not a clear focus on getting from A to B, will allow you to begin to notice what's coming up more. And then finally, naming and hypothesizing gently. I've often used hypothesizing as a powerful way of working, which is just, I wonder if hypothesizing. It's different from phenomenological noticing, because with phenomenological noticing, you're simply naming the experience. With hypothesizing, you're beginning to move into a meaning-making process, which might start with phenomenology, but you're saying, I noticed this, and I'm wondering if that. And it's a wondering, not an interpretation. It's an interpretation, but it's a lightly held interpretation as to opposed to a diagnosis. So finally, why do we shy away from the present then? And it's a question I come to quite a lot, because I do see a lot of supervisors who I would say could be using this a lot more and don't. So I wonder why. I started thinking about it, and number one, it feels personal. Because when you start to say what you notice, you're putting yourself out there. So you feel exposed. You feel you're taking a risk with these things. And it can be easier to put the attention over there rather than here. If I say, I notice when you talk, I'm beginning to feel tired. Not only is it a personal revelation about how you're feeling, but it exposes you to the idea that you're judging them, that there's, it poses a risk that they're going to say, are you saying I'm boring? I mean, they might not say it explicitly, but there might be a rupture in the relationship when you say something like that. And so, of course, the way you say it's very important, but I think sometimes we worry about putting ourselves out there. And then what if I get it wrong? What if I work with the here and now and it's just not relevant? Am I going to look like a fool? Again, it's risky. It can feel risky to work with what's happening here rather than what's happening over there. And so it's a lot easier to stay with the analytical or the professional. And I think also sometimes we simply lack the confidence to do it. We don't know how to do it. How do I say this in a way that's not going to sound clunky? I remember working with a newish supervisor once, and she was saying to me, I really want to follow your lead, Nick, and start to say what's coming up for me in the moment. And I did it, and it didn't go well. And I asked her, well, what did you say? And she said, oh, I said that, you're being a victim. And I said, well, of course, if you're saying you're being a victim, you're interpreting. You're not naming your experience. You are interpreting on their behalf. And of course, if they don't feel like they're being a victim, that's going to create a rupture in the relationship. And so sometimes and then if that happens, we back off. We go, whoa, that whole here and now thing is challenging. I don't like it. It's risky. I end up making a fool of myself, or I end up being attacked for getting it wrong. And I can understand that. I can really understand it. And that's why it's about the power, the skill, if you like, of being able to name in a way that doesn't judge, and in a way that doesn't analyze, or in a way that doesn't diagnose. Okay, to begin to wrap this up, I want to now contextualize the idea of working in the moment with the wider picture, because you're not just going to work in the moment. I think sometimes we get a little bit too idealistic with a certain way of working, and we say, I work in the moment. Well, actually, working on the there and then is a really critical part of what we do in supervision. And so we need to be able to look back and look forward and work with what's in between. And so if we think about balancing timeframes in supervision, we can think of it in these terms. First of all, when you're being retrospective, you're looking at what happened, what's to be learned from that and what actually happened and how did you experience it and so on. And then when you think about the present moment, you're talking about what's happening right now. And those two, they balance each other beautifully, but they're not the only two parts. You've also got the third, which is the prospective part, which is what might be emerging. How are you going to do things differently? And so you end up with balancing the past, the present, and the future. And so whilst this whole presentation has been on working in the present moment, it's really critical to realize that it balances both with the retrospective and the prospective. And the present moment is often the bridge between the two, because what we can do is look at what happened practically, how do you feel about it now, and what are you going to change for the future? So let's reframe the present. The present is not tangential. It's not something that happens to be looked at occasionally. It's a key part of the work you do. So instead of thinking only about the past and the future, start to bring in the present moment in a very deliberate, powerful way. Don't treat it as a tangent, treat it as something that's really critical to the work you do. Realize that what's alive and kicking right now in this moment is often the same pattern that's playing out somewhere else in the system. And it's vital, your role as a supervisor is to help draw that out. And realize that you develop systemic awareness through live attention to what's happening in the present moment and how the system might be part of that. So when we think of reframing the present in those terms, it becomes a much more powerful space than simply the moment we do the work that looks backwards and forwards. So here's some experiments on how you might build comfort working with the here and now. Over the course of the next week or next month or whatever works for you, notice one thing. Just one thing. When you're in a supervision session, don't worry about trying to become suddenly the guru of working in the moment. Notice one thing. Pause and name one present moment observation you have. Use I noticed. Just use it once, twice. I noticed ... I noticed your energy shifted when we started talking about this topic. I noticed you paused when you began to talk about XYZ, whatever it might be. Just try I noticed, because to notice something is to do it now. It brings you into the here and now. You have no choice but to talk about the here and now if you notice something. And embodied check-in. At some point during your supervision, stop and both for yourself and for your supervisee, ask, what are you sensing in your body right now? Or in your case, what am I sensing in my body right now? Just stop. Even if you just do it randomly, even if it's not a response to something, just, okay, I'm going to make sure that at halfway through the session, I'm going to do a somatic check-in, or I'm going to get my supervisee to do a somatic check-in. And then finally, at some point during the next week or 2 weeks, when you're with the supervisee, ask for permission to stay in the present moment. Can we stay with what just happened between us for a moment? When you ask that question and you ask that permission, it opens a doorway that's profoundly more powerful than simply doing it yourself. If you were to go, oh, I noticed da 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 da, whatever it might be, you've now got to kind of help the supervisee unwind their imagination or their retrospective memory, whatever it might be. But when you say, can we stay with what just happened for a moment, they engage in a collaborative experiment with you. So finally, conclusion. Supervision, as we all know, is not just a reflective practice. It's alive and kicking in the moment you do it. Don't forget what Donald Schoen talks about, which is you have supervision on action and supervision in action. And one of the things we're doing is we're supervising on action, but we're also in action as we're doing it. So we're doing it even as we're reflecting, even in the moment that it's happening. And then by tuning into the present, we tune into the system itself. I think the more we can realize that The system is a thing which shows up. And when it shows up, it's showing up right now. And so the opportunity is for us to see this thing that's floating everywhere. And then finally, what if this moment is trying to tell us something? If we can remember that question, what if this moment is trying to tell us something? Then we'll always keep the present in mind, even as we talk about the past and the future. I hope that was a useful conversation, a useful presentation. If you're interested in becoming a coaching supervisor and you're not yet one, please head on over to iccs.co. But I appreciate you watching this video. My name is Nick Bolton. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.